Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to the March Property Master webinar. Lovely to see so many of you on the line. Those of you who are new to us, just a little reminder, Property Master is the leading online broker for mortgages in the buy-to-let sector, and I certainly imagine that will be of interest to a number of you today. As ever, I'm joined by our Chief Executive, Angus Stewart. Good morning, Angus.
Good morning, Christine.
And I'm also joined today by James Wood from the National Residential Landlords Association. So good morning, James.
Good morning.
So we are going to, as we always do, give you an overview of what is going on in the buy-to-let mortgage market at the moment. But the focus of much of today will be to talk about issues around tenants, particularly tenants who are facing problems paying their rent. What are the options open to you? How can you help your tenants? What is the current legal situation, and so on? So I'm very delighted that James has given up his time this morning to join us and help us find our way through that difficult area. So first of all, let's just hand over to Angus. Angus, so what's happening at the moment with the buy-to-let mortgage market?
Well, the market, I'm pleased to say, is very buoyant. In the last month since we were here, we've had a budget, and I think what was pleasing for me and for other landlords is that the budget wasn't too challenging for us. I mean, I think some of us were expecting there might have been greater levels of tax take for landlords, and certainly we had last week we had a statement from the Chancellor on tax, and again we were half expecting something on capital gains tax, and that was absent. I think at some stage we may find that we need to take a bit of pain as we recover from COVID and the impact on the economy, but luckily that's not happening at the moment. And then there was some good news coming out of the budget in that the stamp duty cut was supposed to end 31st of March. That was clearly going to cause some challenge, and that's been extended not only at the £500,000 level to the end of June, but also at a £250,000 level, which for landlords is the sweet spot. I mean, in terms of purchases for rental, normally £250,000 or less, and that's extended till end of September. And certainly we're seeing that conveyancers are having some real challenges managing their workloads at the moment. We find the pipeline in terms of the time it takes somebody to get a mortgage is longer than ever at the moment. And so I'm really pleased that the Chancellor has made that extension, because I think there would have been an awful lot of disappointed people if there had been a cliff edge cut off next week. So from that side, I think the news has been relatively good for landlords recently. I mean, it's worth sort of looking at some of the stats that we're seeing just generally in the market. I mean, last year we were worrying what the impact was going to be on house prices during the, and although we got a bit of a dip in the first lockdown, they've been shooting up in most parts of the country. So we're seeing sort of increase in prices, and the buyer demand is highest that we've had, I think, for 15 years or more. There is a lack of supply and clear demand, hence we're seeing prices going up. And so some of the changes and the things that the government have done, and certainly this new introduction of government-based 5% deposits, is going to be good news for people who own property and seeing general increases. And that means there's an opportunity for landlords to look and say, well, do I want to remortgage some of my properties? Can I buy some more? And certainly the number of landlords I've spoken to over the last month, they're looking to expand their portfolios. They're seeing an opportunity here. They're wanting to raise a bit of equity to go and buy another one or two properties, and that's very encouraging when there is clearly an increasing demand for rental properties within the market. So from that side, I think it's absolutely fascinating. We're seeing increased demand for mortgages. We're seeing increased demand for purchase, and we've got landlords who are looking at their portfolio and saying, yeah, now's the time to expand and do a little more.
That's interesting. So a degree of optimism there. I mean, those of you who are on the line, do give us all your views on how you're feeling about the market. Use the chat box to ask any questions you like of either Angus or or James, but it's almost like we've got two ends of the spectrum here, Angus. We've got good news for landlords. We've got increasing house prices, increasing rents as well from the figures I've seen, perhaps outside of the cities or outside of London. But then on the other side of the coin, we've got people who are struggling. So, I mean, James, in terms of tenants who are struggling with rent payments, what's the scale of the problem that you're seeing at the NRLA?
Well, I'd say the scale is quite large. It's less large than some people might estimate, but we're still talking about around about 800,000 renters went into some form of rent arrears over the course of the pandemic. I think one of the things to put it into context is at the start of the pandemic, Greater Manchester, which is where I'm based. That had more people in social housing claimed some form of benefit than people in the private rental sector. Landlords typically preferring to rent to someone who's got a job, full-time income, and has been fully referenced. Over the course of the pandemic, that's completely switched around. The number of people claiming benefits in the social housing sector has stayed relatively static, while the number of people who claim universal credit in Greater Manchester in the private rental sector doubled to make it the largest group in the city. So a lot of landlords now are facing the challenge of trying to navigate a benefit system that they may not have had experience before, and in fact most landlords won't have had experience with it before now. But the pandemic has forced many landlords to become well acquainted with universal credit because of the sheer volume of tenants who are falling into arrears. But at the same time, we're also finding that landlords themselves are providing their own form of support for tenants. Our research at the start of the pandemic found that if a tenant fell into rent arrears and told their landlord about it, 90% of landlords came back with some form of financial solution, whether it was a rent reduction or a deferral of payments or the like. So what we found is the private rented sector in general has responded magnificently to the challenges of these
That's really good news to hear, because as you were saying, James, both sides, both tenants and landlords, in many of these situations will never have been in this position before.
No, it's very strange. It's a very difficult area to navigate as well for landlords.
Yes, I mean we can see it. In fact, want to thank the NRLA for the resources on the site, which I now know you are responsible for writing. So
thank you.
that was great, James. But we may have landlords on the line today, and if you are one of them, please do post your questions to James in the chat box. But if all of a sudden rent does stop and you've never been in this position before as a landlord, what should you do? What would be the advice you'd give?
I think the important thing is to be proactive. There's we haven't had a lot of landlords. Typically, landlords in the private rental sector haven't experienced rent arrears. When the government studied this, they found about 9% of renters prior to the pandemic fell into rent arrears. So it's quite a rare occurrence. It might come as a shock to the landlord. But the important thing is to be proactive and friendly as well. So go contact them, presume there is an issue that has caused this, and make that clear within the letter that it might not be their fault. And if they come back to you and start discussing the rent arrears, work with each other to come up with a suitable payment solution. You may find, say, the person is self-employed. If they have suddenly lost a lot of their income because of the pandemic, for instance, because of the way the self-employment grants work, they might have a bit of a wait to get the money, but they will get the money. So a rent deferral would probably be the best solution in that case. Whereas if a tenant is employed and has lost their job, the best thing to do is work with them to signpost them to places like the Universal Credit page, for instance, which can tell them tell them how to make an application, or they can speak to the local authority about discretionary housing payments. A lot of local authorities are currently sitting on quite large amounts of discretionary housing payments at the moment that can be used to sustain a tenancy. And once you've done all of that, make sure you're being clear about when the rent deferral ends or the rent reduction ends, and when they'll be expected to pay whatever they've agreed to pay, and what date it'll start from.
Does this have to be a legal document, or
No,
as long as it's documented in some way?
Just as long as it's documented, that's the important thing. At this stage, you really want to be quite friendly with them and build up a good relationship with them, because there have been a lot of studies on this from the government's nudge and budge department, as they call it, this nudge theory of behavioral science. And what they've tended to find is the people who get the best results when someone falls behind with their rent arrears are the ones that keep a relationship friendly, remind them how far they've progressed with paying off any rent arrears, and thank them for any arrears payments they've made. All of these things contribute together to improve the likelihood of continued repayments and also overpayments themselves.
So it's all about keeping that dialogue going, which
Absolutely.
when you think about it, makes sense, because they may well be in a state of shock if they've lost their job or lost their income.
Absolutely.
You can imagine a sort of paralysis kind of setting in.
Yeah, very much the case. A lot of the studies that have been done, and particularly the interviews with people affected by the pandemic, have shown that for the most part, the people who were affected have never experienced falling into arrears before. These are people who are extremely good tenants in terms prior to the pandemic, and this has come as a body blow to a lot of them, because they pride themselves on not having a bad credit history and the like. So it's important to be supportive at the start and identify if they are those kind of tenants. You want to work with them. If they're using the pandemic as an excuse to not pay rent at all, then you may need a different approach. But the vast majority of tenants will fall into the first camp, not the second one.
Yeah. So a question here from Kashif, question for James. If a tenant owes £5,000 in rent and moves out, the police know their new address. Can the police give the address to my solicitor? If not, how can I take the tenant to court if the police do not give the tenant's address?
The police may be able to give the address to your solicitor. I think it's unlikely, though. A lot of the time they won't provide that address. Typically, what we've advised in the past in these sort of situations is to use a tracing service. If your tenant has moved over a few months after they've moved, they'll typically have built up some form of credit file. And then a tracing service will find them. You'll then have that address, and you can serve your claim upon that address. I would say, though, that at the moment, given the delays in the courts, etc., you're probably not in a great rush to get that money back, because you will be waiting quite a significant amount of time to actually be able to enforce a judgment or get it in the first place.
Yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit there, Kashif. Just wanted to come back, James. You were talking about benefits there. With universal credit, for example, is it possible for the landlord to have rent paid direct to them from benefits? And if so, how do you do that?
Yes, it is. Well, in theory, it is. There is a system in universal credit called alternative payment arrangements, and now these alternative payment arrangements are typically for social housing, but where your tenant has a history of rent arrears at your property, so once they fall into a month arrears, or when they fall into 2 months arrears, you can make your application for an alternative payment arrangement, and these direct payments are made via the government's website now. It used to be a form called a UC47, which tended to get lost in the post, but it's now an online portal. So I'd say go to the Universal Credit page, look for alternative payment arrangements, and you'll find the link on there for you to make the application. Once the tenant is in 2 months of arrears, that should be what's called a tier 1 requirement for payments, and that should mean that you are automatically entitled to receiving the payments direct from that point on. Though it doesn't always work out like that. It should do. There's a good chance at that point you'll receive
James, does the tenant need to agree for that payment to come direct to you, or as the landlord, can you make the application even if the tenant isn't in agreement?
You'll have to make the application yourself. The way local housing allowance and or housing benefit used to work was that you could agree to have the payment made direct at the start of the tenancy agreement, and many people did that. They'd have a letter to send to the local authority saying, I want my rent paid directly to the landlord. But the idea behind universal credit is to teach people to manage their money. How effective that's been is up to somebody else to decide. But that means that there's a presumption that tenants should get the money. So it's only at certain points that landlords should be able to receive direct payments, and the most common one is once they're 2 months in arrears.
This is what Sharik is asking. Sharik says, after 2 months of rent arrears, is it that you don't need the tenant's permission or approval? Can you just go for that? No. You don't. So hopefully, Sharik, that's the answer there that will help you. You mentioned direct housing payments from local councils. How do they work, and where is that money? How could you advise a tenant to access that money if it might help them?
The discretionary housing payments are a fund that the local authorities have to give to tenants in the event that they fall into arrears or something like that. They're typically used just before the end of the tax year because they have to be at that point, and they are used to sustain any tenancy where, say, the tenant is currently in 2 months of arrears and potentially able to be evicted as a result of these arrears. They'll use some of that discretionary housing payment to bring them below the 2 month threshold and sustain the tenancy that way. But obviously, given the pandemic now, there'll be a lot of people in more than 2 months of arrears. So if you do get your tenants to apply early for discretionary housing payments, which they'll be able to do via a page on the local authority website, or contacting the local authority directly, they'll at least get to the start of the queue, so they might be able to get in there while there's still discretionary housing payments available.
And that's useful to know, because I guess, from a local authority point of view, they would then, if those arrears built up and an eviction happened, they would need to rehouse those people. So it kind of makes sense for them to avert that. Yeah,
absolutely. The local authorities do want to avoid as much as possible having to house new people. There's obviously not enough houses in the social housing sector, so where they can prevent an eviction, they absolutely will.
But coming up to the end of the tax year, your advice to landlords would be to get your tenant to do it in the next few days.
Yeah, basically. The sooner you get it done, the better. But there's a lot of them who do seem to be sitting on it for the end of the possession restrictions and the chain. And once COVID ends, there's a lot of them sitting on an extra pile this time because they're expecting to need to sustain a lot of tenancies.
So that makes sense. So because of the ban on evictions, the local authorities know that people are not going to be homeless.
Yeah.
So what is actually happening with this ban, James? Where are we now? It's easy to lose track with the extension after extension.
So where we're at the moment is we are in version 3 of the lockdown. I like to call it version 3. So at the start of the pandemic, notice periods were changed to 3 months in England and 3 months in Wales, and then later in the year, before the courts reopened, they extended most notices to 6 months, and then opened the courts, and then they kept the notices the same, but they closed the bailiffs, or they effectively closed the bailiffs. They said that a bailiff is only able to work in an area where they're allowed to enter somebody's home. So in areas like Greater Manchester and Leicester and the like, that meant that the lockdown has just continued from March. Bailiffs have not been able to operate in most circumstances. there are some limited exceptions to this, which the NRLA fought for. You are still able to use a bailiff if the tenant, if you've used a Section 8 notice for rent arrears, and the notice period and the tenant is in 6 months or more of arrears, or you've used a Section 8 notice and it was because of antisocial behaviour, and there are some other limited exceptions, but they really don't come up. I wouldn't worry too much about those. But they're the key ones. If your tenant's in 6 months of arrears and you've served the Section 8 notice, you are still able to apply for a bailiff, and so the bailiff ban won't apply to you, or antisocial behaviour. But if you've served the Section 21 notice or you're using a different ground on Section 8, then effectively the possession ban is still very much in place, and you won't be able to do anything about it until the end of May.
The end of May. Just hold that thought, come back on this Section 21, Section 8, because I don't know how, but we've got a question here from Mohammed. I wonder if I could just put to you, James. He says, my tenants are receiving benefits and are refusing to sign a new tenancy agreement. I don't know whether that's something you can offer some advice on, James.
I'd question why you'd want them to sign a new tenancy agreement, to be honest. The tenancy agreement is continuing as a periodic tenancy anyway, and if tenants are in receipt of benefits, and there's no need for you to give them a new tenancy agreement. If you want to use it, if you want to increase the rent, you can do so via a Section 13 notice. There's one available on the NRLA's website if you or on the government's website. And then I just leave the tenancy rolling as a periodic tenancy while they're in those circumstances, and that gives you the opportunity when the pandemic ends that to end the tenancy if necessary. So I just not sign a new tenancy agreement in that situation.
Yeah. Let's just roll on. So coming back to what you were saying before, I don't know how familiar everybody is with these terms. What is the difference between Section 8 and Section 21?
These are the two types of what's called notices seeking possession. So these are the notices that you serve as a landlord to give you the right to go to court. And by far the most common one is Section 21, and this is the one that the Renters Reform Bill, which is in the works from the government, is set to remove. And this is often referred to as a no-fault procedure. It's not really. It's no reason explained procedure, because when a landlord seeks possession, they're invariably doing it because of some reason, whether be it rent arrears or they need to move into the house or something. But it's procedurally, it's a lot easier to deal with. It's entirely paper-based. You don't need to go to court. And so it's significantly more common amongst landlords. I think it's 70 to 80% of all notices are Section 21s, depending on which research is being cited. But the other one, which is staying after the Renters Reform Bill, is the Section 8 notice, and that is grounds-based possession, where you have to explain your reasoning. And there's a lot of different grounds for breach of tenancy, antisocial behaviour. The landlord wants to move back into the property. The tenant hasn't got immigration, hasn't got the right to stay in the UK. But by far the most common ones are the three rent arrears grounds, which are grounds 8, 10, and 11. And typically, whenever you see a Section 8 notice from a private renter sector landlord, it's going to include those three grounds at some point, because they are the ones that landlords tend to use to gain possession of their property. But like I say, it's very rare in comparison to a Section 21 notice.
Yeah, and of course, eviction and repossession generally is less than 1% of tenancies end that way, which is good news all round. I mean, the courts at the moment must be pretty log jammed. How are they making decisions about who they look at first?
I think the answer, judging from the statistics, is probably pretty poorly. In quarter one of last year, or quarter four of last year, there's something like around 500 cases in total went to a bailiff, which is obviously well below the capacity that they have. That's less than 2 cases across across 3 months per bailiff in the country. But the way the courts are currently doing it is they're using effectively a priority system. So when you apply to court, you will be given you'll be given 2 hearings, a review hearing and an S hearing, a substantive hearing, and that's just to delay things and clog it up a bit and give them a few extra weeks to deal with things. But once they've received your case, they'll check the case to see what the basis of the possession claim is, and then they'll order it on the basis of the seriousness of the case. So if you have rent arrears of more than 9 months, for most landlords, 12 months for larger landlords, then you'll be higher than a case that's already in the system, where it's a Section 21 notice or some other ground that's low priority. At the top of all of them is antisocial behaviour. If there is serious antisocial behaviour, it goes right to the top of the priority queue, and it should be dealt with as soon as the courts are able to do so. But all of the courts are operating at a slower pace because they're doing so using social distancing, which means that there's only about 10 cases per day are held, which is significantly below what they used to be. The average possession hearing case was only about 5 to 10 minutes long prior to the pandemic, and now every case takes a minimum of an hour to deal with, because you have to clean the court down and make sure everything's set up again afterwards.
Goodness. So patience, I think, if you are in that position,
yeah,
is called for.
Absolutely. There are ways you can. I think it's best to think about it from as what you can do about it at the end of May. People should expect the courts to continue to be slow for quite some time afterwards. There was virtually no possession cases in the UK between March and December of last year. So there is a backlog there, despite landlords obviously responding well to the pandemic. So expect long court wait times, and if you are desperate to get possession back and you can't work it through with your tenant, once you have a possession order, or even at the possession hearing, you may want to consider talking to a High Court enforcement officer, just ones you see on TV on Can't Pay, Take It Away, and Nightmare Tenants, Slum Landlords. If you speak to a High Court sheriff, which is what these people are, you can transfer it up to the High Court and have a faster response time from their version of bailiffs, because they're privatised and they typically only take 2 to 3 weeks to process, whereas a bailiff might be taking 8 to 16 weeks to process.
That's useful to know. Oh, there's a quick question here from Tusha. I wonder, Angus, what your view is of this from the lender point of view. Tusha's looking to buy a property that has a tenant in situ. He doesn't particularly want the tenant. Is there anything he can do about that? He's on a very strict deadline because he's trying to meet the stamp duty holiday. What's the view of lenders when there are tenants in situ? Is there any issue there, Angus? Or?
As long as they're good paying tenants, most buy-to-let mortgage companies don't have an issue with that. And for many landlords, they might want somebody who's in there paying rent immediately if they've been a good tenant to the previous owner. So there's clearly a market there of being able to buy properties with a tenant in situ. And I think the question for Tusha is, why does he want the tenant out? And if he's a good tenant, why would you do that? If he's a bad tenant, then clearly there's a process you need to adopt, which James has been talking about, which looks a little challenging at the moment. So if you definitely want the guy out, you've got to ask yourself, do you really want to buy this property at this moment in time, if that's a condition for you? Because it could easily be 6-12 months to actually get the guy out, I would guess, in current situation, especially
Tusha's just said he wants to move into the property. So I don't know, James, how does that work?
I think you need to speak to the vendor, to be honest. Angus is absolutely right. It's going to be very challenging to get hold of a possession order in this time. So it may be the case that the tenant might be, it might be the case that the tenant might be financially persuaded to leave with an offer of some cash to leave early. But realistically, the courts themselves aren't going to be any assistance to you in the next 2 to 3 months. It's going to have to be an informal arrangement, and the only informal arrangement really is likely to be giving you some money to leave before completion.
Kashif's just chipped in here saying, Tusha, you can tell your solicitor to tell the landlord to tell the tenant to leave. I did this. So Kashif's had a similar situation.
Not as easy as that. I mean, if you're normally selling a property, you might sell it with vacant possession. Clearly, this has been put on the market without vacant possession and selling a property with a tenant in situ. Yes, the existing owner could go through a process to exit that tenant, but we know that if the tenant doesn't want to go, it could be months if he's going through a Section 21. Especially if the guy's paying his rent and he's not in arrears, then I think you've got more challenge of trying to get that moving quickly. So, I mean, I think your choices there are buy another property, and then you've got the issues with the stamp duty threshold, whether you can get that through in time, or you buy it and you've got that tenant in situ, and you manage the process through, and you end up having to live elsewhere. But I think if you are buying a property with a tenant in there, if you haven't agreed, vacant possession, then buyer beware in some of these situations. I think it's quite a, let's say a buy-to-let landlord might want that tenant in there, but if you're looking for residential purposes, you should be going with vacant possession. Otherwise, you could end up with a challenge evicting that.
Yeah. So, question here from Alex James. What is the reason for the removal of Section 21? It's been talked about for a long time. I mean, what is the thinking behind it?
I think the thinking is there's many different thoughts around this, and one of them is purely political. The fact of the matter is there is a significant amount of renters in the UK, and in the 2000 and I'm losing track of how many elections there were now. The first of Jeremy Corbyn's election attempts, the Tories picked up virtually no private renters at all. So they have been looking more into things to support renters. And then there's the fact that, as I was saying before, Section 21 is used primarily because it's easier, and that's because the Section 8, which is there to actually give you a reason to evict someone. It's there to identify the reason and support you through it, but it really doesn't do its job very well at the moment. It's not really fit for purpose. So the idea is if they remove Section 21, and then people can actually see the reasons why landlords can need to repossess their property, but they also make Section 8 fit for purpose at the same time by introducing grounds that are reflective of why landlords need possession, and also to make sure that the current grounds that do exist are strengthened. I'm thinking here particularly of things like rent arrears and antisocial behaviour and damage to the property, or refusing to allow you in to perform absolutely necessary legal requirements like gas safety certificates and electrical safety reports and the like. These things should lead to possession under the new version. But also at the same time, they'll explain why you needed possession. So it's no longer a case of landlords being these people who evict with no reason, which has never been the case. But Section 21 has allowed people to make the case that landlords do evict without good reason. If we have a working Section 8 notice and a working Section 8 procedure that supports landlords, everyone will be able to see where the issues are with the private rented sector, and you'll find that landlords will be able to actually continue to do exactly what they're doing now, because most of them do seek possession because of rent arrears or damage or antisocial behaviour and the like. It'll just be a different form, provided, of course, that it does actually work as the government is promising, and that's the kind of thing the NRLA is currently campaigning on. And if you do want to see what our proposals are for these changes, please do look on our campaign section of the website, and you can read about it in more detail.
It's important they get this balance right, that landlords are able to still take possession of their property when there are reasonable grounds to do so.
Yeah. And I remember when we did a massive survey a few years ago of, I think it was the biggest of its kind ever, that wasn't performed by the government. And we did a survey, and it was something like 87% of all Section 21 cases related to rent arrears. And really, that just translates straight over to the Section 8 notice. So for a lot of landlords, nothing's going to change except the heading at the top of the page, really.
I mean, I think this is all part of the government's goal of professionalising the sector, so that if you've got a landlord who's got multiple properties, then the only reason they would want somebody out is if they're antisocial or not paying rent or some of the other things which are covered effectively by Section 8.
Yeah.
And it gives the tenant greater security of longevity of their tenancy. Compared with other countries, we have ASTs of 6 months, 1 year, sometimes 3 years, never really longer than that. And you look at other countries where somebody will be a tenant for 10 or 20 years in a property. And I think the government's looking at it saying, well, you've got all these tenants who are having to move every few years because the landlord might just want, maybe the landlord wants to move in, but they didn't need to have any real grounds for under the Section 21. And I think this is all part of this greater professionalism, which we're seeing a substantial reduction in the numbers of landlords with 1 or maybe 2 properties, and significant growth in those portfolio landlords. And I tie this all into that. And as James says, if you need to get out somebody who's not performing against the contract with a Section 8, in non-pandemic times, you can do that. So I don't think our landlords should unduly be worried about that.
That's good to hear. So a comment here from Chiz that I missed earlier on. Apologies. If you want to sell vacant position, you still currently need 6 months notice.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Chiz, that's correct. Any other questions? Please do pop
There
them in the chat box.
When we ask a question box, Chris, I don't know if you can see those.
Yes, I think we've picked them all up. If there's anything I've missed, do let me know. I think I've picked them up as we've gone along. In the ask a question. Goodness. Thank you here. Many apologies. Helen, if the rent income is low, I don't have other income, can I apply for universal credit?
You'll have to speak to the DWP or make the application yourself. They'll be able to tell you whether or not you qualify for universal credit. There are thresholds of savings and income that you receive to decide whether or not you can apply. But it's an individual thing that you'll need to make the application for to find out, really.
I know we've got somebody in the green room at the moment. My person in the green room, I think I've put a link to a benefits calculator. If you have that, if you could post that for Helen, that might help. Helen, there are a couple of these benefits calculators that I've seen online which give you some insight into what might be available to you. So do try those. And there's another one here from Chris. Where do I get the forms to complete for taking court action? I think we've posted those. If not, yes, we have. Those are there on the screen.
If I can. The government's done lots to protect people during this pandemic with furlough and delaying evictions and all the court. What's your prediction in terms of what's going to happen post furlough, in terms of unemployment, the impact on people, impact on courts? Do you have a view as to what we're likely to see in the last quarter of this year?
I think what we're likely to see is a long COVID recovery for services that have been delayed. So I wouldn't expect the courts to be back and operating at their previous speeds until 2022. and to be blunt, the speeds weren't very good before then, so it's not like it's going to be great. In terms of what's going to happen for financial support, it's interesting for landlords that they really are an area that's fallen through the cracks of financial support. There's the mortgage holidays were something that was touted at the start, but there's been a lot of reports of it being used to prevent people from expanding their portfolio, for instance, if they took it. So this has been something landlords have typically tended to avoid. Similarly, they don't often qualify for universal credit or any of the other financial support. So I think what we're going to see is there needs to be something more alongside furlough and the self-employment grants to support and sustain tenancies where rent arrears are built up, because at a certain point landlords simply can't afford to continue to accept that. So what the NRLA has been doing, along with quite a lot of other groups across the whole sector, including Shelter, for instance, is we've been pressing the government to set up low or no interest tenancy saver loans and grants, and we'll continue to push for this probably after the pandemic as well, because while restrictions might end, we might soon be able to go out to a gig or the pub again. Those rent arrears aren't disappearing anytime soon, and there needs to be some form of financial support. So we'll push for that, and we'll probably have quite a bit of time where the hangover from COVID remains across the sector.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think we're going to have a hangover. I'm concerned about the levels of redundancies we might see post furlough. We may find some of the businesses that have been supported through furlough can't sustain themselves post pandemic because it's cost them too much to just trying to keep afloat. So I have a feeling we haven't seen the end of this, and we may end up with tenants who've been supported and have been paying their rent through furlough suddenly without a job, and that's going to be more pressure on universal credit and more challenges for some of our landlords. So and I'd agree with your comment. I mean, we've certainly seen from mortgage applications, if you as a landlord have taken a mortgage holiday with lender A, you may find lenders B, C, and D are not willing to lend to you to expand your portfolio. I think sometimes the lenders have a slightly different view in terms of how some of this support has been used by landlords, which, given that I don't think any landlord would go and take a mortgage holiday without giving due consideration, I think is perhaps a little unfair if they've got significant arrears on their book from some of the, a landlord should be able to absorb some arrears, absolutely, but the scale of arrears with some people have been seeing, I think probably is a little too much for to be considered in that way.
Yeah. No. And I think a lot of landlords did. Initially, when the guidance came out, they were told it wouldn't affect their credit rating, which was probably the reason that quite a few applied, and then were later shocked to find that it did, in fact, have some impact on the application.
Yeah, well, technically, it doesn't affect their credit rating or their credit score. However, it is a question that's asked, and lenders believe that anybody who has taken such a support must themselves be in financial distress. And we're seeing it with people who've taken bounce back loans. I look at the bounce back loan and the terms and conditions of that in terms of interest free for a year and then 2.5% for what now up to 10 years. It's a bargain that none of us are ever going to see again in our lifetime. Any business person is going to look at some of these supports and say, why wouldn't I take it? And some of these lenders don't look at it in the same way. And so I think landlords need to be careful about the potential impact of taking some of the support if they're looking to expand their portfolios.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming to an end now, but any other questions, please do put them in the chat box or in Ask a Question, which I will now very carefully monitor. James, just before you go, I've read about something called breathing space regulations. What are those?
Well, they're part of the future, effectively, of the post-pandemic future, and they're part of this whole debt resolution, debt mediation system the government's planning to set up. From May the 4th, your tenant, if they're in unsustainable debt, will be able to apply to a debt advisor for what's called a breathing space. And a breathing space is effectively just a time period where the creditor, which in this case would be you, can't chase or enforce judgments against the tenant for those arrears. So if you are notified your tenant's gone into a breathing space, for the period of time, you can't send them letters asking for the rent arrears. You can't serve a Section 8 notice relating to the rent arrears, or enforce an existing possession order relating to the rent arrears, etc. And over the course of that time period, the debt advisor and the tenant are expected to work together to find a debt solution. Now, during this time period, they are also expected to continue to pay their rent. So there's two things to think about here. One is you shouldn't see the rent arrears build up any further, because if they do, the tenant isn't meeting their breathing space obligations and it should be cancelled. So freeing you up to do whatever work you need to do in this area. And secondly, it's the fact that most landlords simply don't receive any of the money from rent arrears. If a tenant goes into rent arrears, typically the landlord never sees a penny of this. Tenants have few assets. They're not generally a good person to chase after through small claims. But because they have to come to a debt solution at the end of their breathing space, it actually means that there's a higher likelihood that tenants will actually enter into a repayment plan and start actually repaying their debts. Now there are two different types of breathing space, and that's the reason I'm a bit vague on the dates, on the time periods here. There's a standard breathing space, which is the one that virtually all applicants will go into. And they last 60 days in total. So for 60 days, you won't be able to enforce anything in relation to the rent arrears. And then there's a mental health crisis breathing space, which lasts for the duration of the treatment, which is on average 1 month, plus 30 days on top of that. And that is only available in circumstances where the tenant has been sectioned or detained or moved under the powers given to the police and medical professionals under the Mental Health Act, or they're receiving emergency or crisis or acute care in relation to it. So it's not just any old form of mental illness. It has to be something so serious that it requires intervention effectively and restraint by somebody else.
And can that be on top of the original breathing space? So you get 120 days.
Oh no, it's well, sort of. A standard breathing space, which is what most people go into. It's 60 days, and then they can't enter into another one for a year. A mental health crisis breathing space can be entered into multiple times throughout the year. So if someone is in mental health crisis and they keep slipping in and out of it, then potentially you can have multiple breathing spaces. But I would say this is going to be extremely rare. There aren't that many people who get sectioned or detained by the police under the Mental Health Act, and typically these situations resolve themselves within a week or two, rather than months. So it's likely the mental health crisis ones will actually be shorter than the standard breathing space. That's
interesting to hear. And on the first one, the more sort of standard one, it could indeed, promote this dialogue that we were talking about at the start.
Yeah. No, it is something that I think people who've been affected by the pandemic are actually the ideal people for these standard breathing spaces, because their finances were affected, they couldn't pay it, but they are now, as they return to full-time work and lockdown ends, they'll now be in a position where they can potentially overpay their rent, and that means that they are a good candidate for a debt solution. They should be a good candidate for breathing space, and as long as they stick to it, which they'll have to because of they've agreed it with the debt advisor, you should actually see these payments formalized. So yeah, potentially people who've been affected by the pandemic are the exact people that breathing space is targeting, even though breathing space was developed before the pandemic had even been thought about.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time, James. I just hand back to Angus again. It's a tale of two halves here, really. I was just before coming on air, saw that people new onto the housing ladder. Some 27% of them were saying that it was the savings they accumulated during the pandemic that have helped them on the housing ladder. So it just tells you here. So we're going to see this demand for housing carry on, do you think?
I certainly hope so. I've just bought myself a house. I was one of those people. I just had to go through all of the conveyancing delays that Angus was talking about earlier myself.
But you met the deadline.
Yeah, I had to do a lot of shouting at the buyers, my previous property, the buyer of my previous property's solicitor, because it took them quite some time to get the mortgage out. But we did eventually make the deadline, and yeah, moved into the new house.
Well
But
done.
I do think you're absolutely right. It is a tale of two cities, really. For people like myself who've been able to work from home full time, it's been great. I can no longer buy records or go to the restaurants. Well, it's not been great. They're all my favourite things, but it has meant that I've been able to save up.
Save some money, yeah.
But for the people who aren't in that situation, it has been a terrible time, and there needs to be support for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But Angus, the support the government's given seems to have underpinned the housing market, doesn't it?
Well, I think generally the government should be applauded for the support it has given various sectors. There are elements of, there's some sort of smaller businesses, directors who've been running on dividends who've really missed out on some of the support. There are segments, I think there's 2 or 3 million people who have really been struggling as a result of this. But I think in terms of what we're talking about here, the people who've really struggled are those tenants who have been in hospitality and retail jobs, which they've just not received any income properly for the best part of a year. And I think the one thing I'd say is it's great that we've got a vaccination program. We can see some light at the end of the tunnel. And we may not be allowed to go abroad on holiday this year, but if we can open up our economy and continue to see some improvements, then that's good news. And I, for one, am looking forward to having a beer in the near future, and secondly, having a haircut.
I was just going to say the haircut.
Me too.
Thank you all on that note. I think we'll end. Thank you so much for your time, James. Thank you, Angus. Thank you, everyone on the line. See you again next month. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.